All right, good afternoon. Hello, everybody. It's great to see you. I'm Ned Murray. I'm coming to you, I think, as you can see, live from the Welcome Center at Table Rock State Park in South Carolina. Having a long weekend getaway, but taking some time out to join this panel of folks to talk about the future of education. I'm really excited. I'm glad you all are here. You have an incredible treat in store for you. Not because of me, but because of this panel that's just got really rich perspective and history with education and thoughts, and I think you'll find it incredibly stimulating. We haven't really talked a lot about our content. I think everybody now sort of knows each other and our paths have crossed a little bit, but you'll hear from the introductions and you can see from their bios. They have very different perspectives on the world and on the world of education that I think will enrich and enliven this conversation. The format we have planned is to just move through really at least 4 questions that we think are sort of relevant and top of mind right now for this session. The first question, and I'll pose it one at a time to each of the panelists and give you a brief introduction to them so you have a sense of who you're hearing from and their perspective and give them a chance to enrich that with their own additions. But we're just going to start with going back before the pandemic and pre-COVID, what trends these folks saw in education, primarily K through 12 education, although it's hard to completely separate that from higher ed. But we're going to look primarily at K-12 education and what these folks were observing in that ecosphere prior to COVID. And then we'll come to the pandemic, the last 11 months or so, and what impact they have seen that has had. How has that either changed the trends and direction of education or impeded some of that or perhaps accelerated? But these past 11 months, what impact has this had on what they're seeing and where education in our country is headed or in the world? And then logically we'll move to, as we come out of COVID and the restrictions, what do they see as the new trajectory and pathway of education, new trends and things to pay attention to in education? And then we'll get to our 4th question, lastly, which is the one probably you've come here for. We want to bring it home for folks and ask these folks to talk about, given that sort of landscape and that ecosphere of education, what can communities like Chattanooga and other communities around the world, what can they do and should they be doing to really ensure that they are developing an education ecosystem that best supports all of its students and its community? And hopefully after we hit those 4 questions, we will have an opportunity to address your questions and comments. This is a new platform for me as the moderator, so I'll primarily focus on the chat. So if you have questions and comments along the way, if you can enter them there in the comments, you should see that, I guess, on your bottom right. And I'll try to monitor that, and these guys will help me. There is a way to give you the microphone, but that's a little bit rich, I think, from my experience with the platform, but we'll see how that goes. So I hope that meets your expectations, and let's just get started. If you haven't had a chance, make sure you read these guys' bios either now or later, and go to their websites. There's going to be a whole lot more. But Ross, let's just start with you. Ross is the Vice President of School Strategies for Explo Elevate. It's a it's a collaboration of schools, really innovative schools. That organization I know a little bit about. They really provide research and professional development and events for their founding schools that are all over the country, really all over the world, and other participants to really think about this issue of being innovative in the field of education. And then what you won't learn from Ross's bio or his website, or you might intuit it, is that he is wicked smart. And I attribute that to the fact that he is an alumnus of the University of the South. But he's also a prolific poet and photographer. So he brings that artist's heart and eye to this conversation. So Ross, First of all, anything that I botched in your intro or that you want to add, go for it. And then
it was very generous. It was too generous. It's always good to get a shout out to Swanee in there. And I see Matt Costello's in the audience this afternoon, and that's another Swanee person. I think of what's been happening over the last year with the pandemic and everything under that umbrella, systemic reckoning with racism, political divides that have been exacerbated. All those things that have happened under that umbrella since last February, in many ways, less than introducing something new to education, they have served as an accelerant in education. So in some ways, we can think of it as a timeline that is like an accordion that's been pulled together over this framework of a last year. And so some of the things I'll mention as trends in education pre-COVID are the same trends we see now, but we're seeing an incredible acceleration to their impact, their challenge, their impact, and the demand for new systems, new ways of thinking so that we can speed up our pace, frankly, to both respond to, yes, but also take advantage of some of the things that are happening because there's some demand we're going to have to meet. So some of the trends pre-COVID that I saw and I love, frankly, is an increased demand for partnerships, increased demand for being connected to our community, to being a part of our community rather than apart from our community, whether it's public school systems, private schools, charter schools. I think that there is a move to knit ourselves more in more complex and dynamic ways into the world around us, which I believe is critical to the sustainability, not just of our schools, but of our communities. So there's a more explicit symbiotic relationship between community and school. We can't miss it anymore. And sometimes we've chosen to miss it, unfortunately, I think, in a desire to preserve status quo in education. I think we're far more willing as a trend pre-COVID, but certainly something that will be more and more the case to cross boundaries in education, to move toward more mastery of skills, human relationships, than pure content. So there is content. Content is something that's accessible through a number of different means other than a teacher standing at the front of the room. That doesn't decrease the value of a teacher. It actually increases the value of a teacher. Teacher as guide, teacher as partner, teacher as example of learner. And that's another area where I think our students have frankly gotten to see us grow over the last year. I was thinking, I was in a meeting, actually it was a program that Lee is a part of as well, and Ned is a part of, Seed and Spark, just seeing how complex we're now able to use chat in a Zoom call. You know, how the dialogue can start over in the chat and then move over to the dialogue. So for a student taking our course, they're watching us learn, which I think is incredibly powerful. So the last thing I'll mention is simply that we've got to look for new sort of axes for our growth. And it's what's drawn me in a number of different directions, but most centrally looking for a new way of telling stories about what we do and why we do it. And we can get to that later, but we've got to look beyond education and beyond educational thinkers to teach us how to invent our way forward. And not simply to be passive victims of what's happening around us, but people who are challenging ourselves to rise to a new occasion. Thanks. I can't hear you, Ned.
You're right. I muted myself while I was listening to you. Thank you. I was just asking everybody if they see what I mean. That was really thought provoking, Ross. We could spend the next hour just on those points we raised. But let's have everybody meet some of these folks. Let's go to Steve Robinson. He has pretty much done it all in education. His website says he is a career educator with a global focus, and I think that just nails it right there. He's been a top administrator at the university level, in high schools, as an association president. He was superintendent of schools for the Episcopal Diocese of Honduras, which is interesting. He's done work with schools in China, and currently is focused as the CEO and founder of Orbis Learning. And this is just a fascinating element to this conversation. Orbis, as I understand it, is an aggregator of learning materials and online courses, with the ultimate goal of establishing learning communities around the world. So, Steve, at some point, we want to hear you talk about learning and what that looks like. First of all, correct anything or add anything to your bio, and tell us, in that diverse background you've had, what you have seen as some of the trends leading up to prior to the pandemic.
Yeah, thanks, Ned. Nothing to add. I would say, however, that when you let crazy smart Ross go first, he says it all mostly. and so those of us that are following a lot of the things that I was thinking, I will try to come up with some other things, but the things I was thinking was exactly what he said. So I would echo everything that he said and support those thoughts. What I was observing pre-COVID, and doing work in the United States with schools, being a part of Education Reimagined kinds of conversations in the U.S., as well as being involved in Honduras, in Central America, where it's a very poor country with a very poor school system there. I've been able to kind of see both poles coming into COVID, and then now during this last year in COVID. And I would say, generally speaking, and it varies across school districts in the U.S., it varies across countries, but generally speaking, what I have been observing for the last 5 or 6 years is a willingness to think more along the line of a focus on learning, as opposed to just the focus on teaching. The idea that the reason we have school, the reason we're there, is because we have school so students will learn, so young people will be learners, and as a part of the kind of the mindset shift to the focus on learning, and Ross mentioned a couple of these, but more toward a competency-based approach rather than a time-restricted approach, where learning becomes the variable, or the constant, and time is the variable, as opposed to time being the constant and learning the variable. That kind of approach, where it's more learner agency is understood to be so relevant to the learning process, and then also an attempt to try to engage relevant content and context to the learning process. So I was, over the last 5 or 6 years, I was real excited to be a part of this kind of thought process and thinking. And I think that still continues, but it was just changed over this past year. And we'll talk more about that. But that is one of the big things that I saw. The other things is what I would consider a rather moderate pace toward the embrace of educational technology. And I say a moderate pace because when you understand teachers and kind of the nature of teachers, they're so vital to us, and they're wonderful, nurturing, caring folks. But also they're folks that tend to like security and tend to like things that they understand in some ways. And I know we can't generalize across all teachers, but the idea that we come in and technology is changing so rapidly that the ability for teaching and learning and that process in school to maintain and stay up with that rapid improvement is almost impossible. So, there was a moderate pace toward that. And I think that was a good thing. And I think this year accelerated that. And I think that's a good thing too. And then obviously, there were schools across America and in other parts of the world that were just trying to survive before COVID. But by and large, I do think in my career as an educator over the last 5 to 10 years, I've seen some progress in a direction that I think is really exciting. And I'm optimistic that it will continue, and we will have learned something during this year that will help us to continue that.
So you cut out on me a few times. Was that just me, or are you guys having the same trouble? Was everybody able to hear Steve?
Yeah, you're cutting in and out.
Perfect. Then we'll assume it's me. We'll carry on. All right. Thank you, Steve. Let's turn to Trung Lee, fascinating human being and thinker. Came really to education, as I understand it, as an architect, an amazing, award-winning, frequently published architect. But he's come to a place where he doesn't just design spaces. He's interested in those spaces being part of a transformational human ecosystem, as I understand it, particularly in the ecology of learning. He launched Third Teacher Plus, which is a think tank that treats.
He's gone.
Taking him over the wall, and they help school systems reimagine themselves in ways that will better serve the communities in which they operate. So his angle is design, but he's really embraced design in all aspects of schooling, not just the buildings, but curriculum and professional development, and designing those spaces that are fully a partner in that, and that don't just meet the current function of a school, but try to meet the school its functional aspirations.
Well, Lee, I'm guessing you're on.
I guess so. I can jump into answering the questions, and hopefully Ned will come back. I think for the most part, there's been a continuous trend in, I would say a very sustaining and, to a certain extent, the model that we're all used to and experienced as we were growing up in the educational system. Some of those trends before COVID, to a certain extent, was trying to unite the discipline so much, trying to find a way to teach students and children how to think critically, how to be global citizens. It's been argued to that those are not really soft skills, right? Collaboration skills, critical thinker, communicators. I think that those trends have been happening, and I think that the innovative schools that are able to push on the edges tends to do better than other schools. I think that the one thing that hasn't changed, which really doesn't allow us to think about new systems, is that education, for the most part, it's still very linear, right? We're kind of preparing ourselves to go through kind of that K-12 system with a very specific way to measure success in order to apply to college. And then once we get into college, we tend to declare a major with the goal of somehow graduate and secure a job, right? I think that kind of linear to the current system really hasn't changed very much, right? And that might be the reason why we haven't seen things really sort of explode, even though everything about the sciences tells us that we need to change drastically. So I think that those narratives need to change before a new system can be designed. Though the one thing that I think that was really important pre-COVID because of this very linear and very prescriptive way of measuring success or measuring how we learn, did have have an impact on the health, on the mental and physical health of children, in the way that they're put under a tremendous amount of pressure, especially I would say at all level, on top of not just the academic pressure, but also just the growing up pressure, the your own psychological and physical growing up, just to get to that level of maturity, and ultimately have a greater sense of who you are in this very challenging and confusing global world. So I think that there's a lot of really good schools everywhere, and there's lots of conversations that we're really starting to focus on mental health and physical health. And I think that those are now only being amplified by COVID. So I think that that might be a really good thing to keep grinding through in terms of how do we create a much more healthy environment for our children to learn in.
You're muted, Ross. Ross, you're muted.
What I'd like to add to that, because it's so provocative, and I don't want us to miss the provocative part of what Lee said, that our schools, the way we've been doing it in such a linear way and built up pressure on kids, COVID is added to that, but we can't keep supporting the same way of going through school when that way of going through school makes kids sick. And we can talk about how COVID has increased mental health challenge, but they're also operating within a context and a system that is revealing its sort of cracks because of the pressure exerted by COVID, but we created the system. So, and if we created it, we can recreate aspects of it to help kids be healthier. And so I think that's such an important corner of the conversation, and I think it's prerequisite to everything else. Yeah. Healthy, happy, engaged kids is the beginning and the end.
Yeah, the cracks are everywhere, right? And I think you spoke toward it to a certain extent, Ross. I mean, one of the things with this linear process is that obviously we're preparing our kids to enter college, and yet college becoming less and less affordable for a lot of us, compounded by the fact that we are entering what I think what all economists and even politicians and people that are keeping a pulse on what's happening in the future is that we're entering a very different kind of global economy. Some have referred to it as the fourth industrial revolution, in which there won't be enough jobs for all of us. There's already been, in the last election, one candidate was really pushing for basic income, just because there is a perception that just autonomy and just the accelerations of technology will create a very different environment. And so those cracks are starting to appear even wider, right? We're putting our kids in positions where they won't be able to afford to pay for college, and yet at the current narrative, it's really the only path forward. And so I think that I think that that's where we're keep having this tremendous tension, not just in the States, but I think globally, in terms of like how do we prepare our children for this world that none of us know and none of us have experienced in any way, right? Just because the accelerations of the changes is coming at us so fast, and only exacerbated by what's happening last year with COVID. So I think that once again we're starting to see climate change is no longer just this theory, scientific paper, but it's starting to play out in our everyday life. And I think we all recognize that because we live in one ecosystem called planet Earth, that obviously everything that we do has a connect relationship and impact to each other. Like, we can't avoid that. I think someone reminded me that we don't look at nature, we look through nature, because we have to start thinking that we're part of it. We can no longer think of ourselves as separate from it.
It's so you brought that up. In a book, by the way, for those of you who don't know, there's a book that Lee was hugely important to creating called Seed and Spark. And in it, there's a great quotation from John Muir, and it's in the beginning of the chapter on relationships. And the quotation is, when we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything else in the universe. Schools sometimes have imagined that they could possibly be existent separate from everything else in the universe. And I think whether we're talking about the fourth industrial revolution, which Lee referred to, that connective tissue between things is so evident in a pandemic. The thing started wherever it started and exploded in a matter of weeks to a global pandemic. And that can play both ways. That same concept can play toward the good, or it can play toward the pandemic.
One of the things that occurs to me is that as we're talking about the way we do school and the linear nature of school now and the need to embrace new models, this idea that if we embrace the idea that the way educators and the way leaders should be thinking about the school process is a process that serves all students, I'm automatically drawn, because of my exposure to kind of the poles of the haves and the have-nots. And the question that I wrestle with a lot is, how do we scale? If we find a model that really focuses on the learner, focuses on all of the things that we've been alluding to as kind of the new way to think about learning and the way that it would work best, if we find that model, how do we scale that so that it's not just the affluent schools or the independent schools or the school districts or the affluent countries that have that opportunity? How do we create something? How do we envision something, understand something that is scalable? And every time we talk about what is going on that's really cool in the education space, I'm automatically drawn to the fact I know people that couldn't pull that off if they tried, either from the training of the professionals in the room, the resources, the technology. I had a long conversation with the bishop of the diocese in Honduras this morning, and we're looking at creating learner communities around the nation of Honduras that is really going through some crises right now with COVID and with a couple of major hurricanes. And when we talk about putting a learner community in a lot of the villages of Honduras, the biggest concern I have is, are we going to be able to get any connectivity? Mm-hmm. How are we going to connect them to the world so that they can experience the kinds of things that the three of us understand is the way forward if we're really going to accomplish the things we're doing? And I think, for public school superintendents, for mayors, for other community leaders, that is one of the things that really has to be a focus is, okay, this will work, but how do we scale this? Mm-hmm. How do we bring it across everyone?
Lee, your work, I guess Vietnam came to mind, where you're dealing with scalability. some. I don't know if that's relevant or not, but sort of thinking more broadly.
Yeah, I've been thinking about that, and I'm not sure if the work that we're doing in Vietnam is about scaling, right? I think that it is also trying to challenge the existing narrative, right? And so I think what it's trying to do most is to create a new system of learning. And it is further connected. Like everything is important because of context, right? I think that if we're going to talk about scale and new ecosystem, we also have to recognize kind of the indigenous wisdom of the place, and I think that each have sort of its own richness and sort of origin stories that I think could be really leverage and celebrate it. And I think that a lot of those solutions and thinking about a new ecosystem, it's part of the origin story, I think. So, Vietnam in the context of that is like, how do we celebrate 4,000 years of history, right? What does it mean to be Vietnamese for a child growing up in a very global world? Where their particular culture is being dominated by K-pop, right? So it's funny, but it's a challenge. It's a challenge. It's a challenge in terms of not paying attention to your own sense of culture and identity, which I think it's really important. Like you really kind of have to. Like I think part of school, part of being involved, part of involved in a community, and I see this really strong in most independent school, is that you do identify your family and who you are as being part of other families, right? And there's that sense of connection, whatever they are. There is a strong sense of community there, and I think that's one of the things that COVID kind of destroy a bit is we did lose that sense of self that is connected to the identity of that particular community. So in some way, I feel that post-COVID is something that a lot of institutions are going to try to regain, or trying to not take that for granted anymore, in developing those really strong relationships.
It took me a while to spot the comments to figure out where they were, having not used this platform before. But I've become interested, but I don't know much about it yet. I think that Lee, you do, but Paige Woods sort of goes to that idea of the ability. So this goes to scalability in an abstract way. But part of what's so hard to imagine how we scale it is that we think we have to scale it within an old model in the States of how we've scaled things. And so I think what we discover is a lot of things don't scale. So a small school can do some things that large schools can't, and vice versa. But in order to think about scalability, we actually have to think outside of the model into which we've tried to scale before, if that makes sense. So if we're thinking of Chattanooga and education, we can't just keep building a 6A public high school and then an 8A or whatever, just endlessly getting bigger and imagine that scaling something. That's not scaling anything. It's how do we scale the efficacy of human connection? How do we attract people to education who will be furtherers of the way we think, rather than simply a new way of doing an old job, or a new habit of doing an old job. And so scalability, I think, to your the initial thread of the topic is really important, but I think we can hyper limit how we're talking about scalability too quickly. So I like thinking of time and architecture, trying in my own head to use some of the same language of how are we designing spaces that then reflect how we respond to those spaces. How do we use time in a school so that we are, the way we construct a daily schedule in a school encourages the way we want to think about being in school or the way we think about learning. But if you're really to have that conversation, you have to think about scaling differently. And benefiting from, like, my perception is Chattanooga, for instance, is a city with some momentum, or a kind of momentum, some things going for it. How do you pair that momentum with the way you think about what schools should look like? How are you talking about Chattanooga, and how are you talking about what schools should be, and how are those two conversations overlaying?
Yeah, as the conversation went on, I was thinking, and I used the word scalability, or how do you scale it? And that might not even be the best word. It's really, because obviously if you scale something that isn't the right model, then that is not a good thing. As you talked about, the 6A and 8A high schools, and most of us know, and as a former member of a public school board, we understand that the cost per seat is much less if it's a bigger school. And what we're talking about is that we think probably it should be going the other way so we could have more community. But I guess it's, to get a little personal here, I was very fortunate to serve as the president of the Southern Association of Independent Schools, which represented almost 400 very elite independent schools in the Southeast and in other parts. Very good schools that you could look to, many of them, and some of them have shown up. I know my colleagues are putting their names up on the comments here. Some of them as examples of this. But I've often told friends and colleagues that I could never have gone to a school that I served in SAIS, because I grew up in a house next to the projects with very little money, going to an inner city high school, an elementary, junior high, and high school. And I didn't have the academic preparation, and I didn't have the finances to go to a school that I was privileged to serve for 7 years as their president. And so I'm always drawn back to the idea of these conversations around what learning should look like, what school should look like, and how that should take place. And then at the same time, realizing we don't want to forget the little Steves either. And how do we as educators and as citizens of the world do our best? We may not be able to accomplish it, but how do we do our best and make what we understand as good learning as pervasive as possible within the all student spectrum?
From your point of view, what are the keys to that? What's central for you?
That's what I would suggest. We have to be able to. Well, first off, we have to be committed to that kind of goal. We have to be committed to the idea that we're not just, taking 20% of the learning opportunities and going to make them the best they can be and forget the rest. We have to have a goal of all students. And what I find, and the probably the learning theory, the psychological or learning theory that I think is most relevant, particularly with the very low income schools or in the inner city schools and schools that struggle the most, is kind of a self-efficacy thing. After you have not succeeded enough, you start to question whether you can succeed. I often use the example that and getting personal again here, and I don't mean to ramble too much, but if you told me, Steve, you walk outside your house right now and you document this, I will give you $1 million cash if you stand flat-footed on the street and jump over your house. I won't even get out of my chair because I have no concept of being able to do that. However, many, many years ago, I was a college basketball player. I wasn't the best jumper, but I had decent hops. And if you told me, Steve, if you go outside, stand flat-footed and jump on the hood of your car and I'll give you $1,000, I might try that because I can remember a time when I could do that. I'd probably break my neck now. But the point being, to the degree that one sees possibility, they have the ability to be motivated. That's the whole Bandura self-efficacy thread theory. And so what I have seen and observed in the places like I grew up was the idea that self-efficacy doesn't exist. One of the things and last thing I'll say, my dad, being personal again, my dad told me when I was working toward my PhD, he asked me one day, he said, Steve, how do you think you can be smart if you're my kid? He had a 6th grade education and he didn't feel like he could. And so I've observed that. And so I think we have to be committed to the all, the concept of the all. And then we have to find ways to allow those that have traditionally not been a part of our thinking at this level to understand and to experience some of these kind of opportunities. So when they experience them, then that again, going back to the theory, just small incremental successes will motivate you to try again. And rambled a little bit and got too personal there, but I think that it is personal with me. And so forgive me for telling personal stories, but I think we have to be committed to the all.
Well, and all learning's personal to a degree, so I don't think you need to worry about apologizing for it. I'm looking at Matt Costello's statement and question, and what I'm thinking about is how trite my response would be in terms of the complexity of what you're trying to do and how to do it. And I was interested to see if Steve or Lee had, because it strikes me it's so important to have the relationships you need to build, but it's hard finding someone to pick up the other end of that rope with you in partnership between your nonprofit and school leadership.
Yeah, I think Stephen, you hit a central, very central naming. Like we can't have a conversation about education in the American context without it being directly connected to the legacy of institutional racism in the United States. Right, it does create a system of have and have not, and continue to create a system of have and have not. And that affects the way that we fund school, right? So I think all these old narratives have to be like deconstructed. Well, I think it has to be named why we choose to use property tax to fund our public schools versus any other kind of system. Right. I mean, I love the story of Michael Crow, the president of ASU, who asked his board, what's the best predictor of academic outcomes in the U.S. and it's zip code. And because we designed a system that way. Right. So we shouldn't be surprised by the outcomes that we're getting. So I think that like we just have to own some of these construct that we created in the past. And I think the only way that we're going to be able to create a new ecosystem is just naming it, owning up to it, and trying to together create a new narrative. The one interesting thing is there's been lots of surveys about what American worker wants to do post-COVID, and over 90% of American workers do not want to go back to the office 5 days a week. 90%, right? But in the world of education, there is no drastic change in attitude. Like, for the most part, there's an urgency to really get back to the way we were operating before. And the obvious reasons that, now we do recognize that relationship, that face-to-face relationship that forms a community, is really important. And for most of us, I mean, that's the value proposition, right? That, and especially for higher ed, I mean, that you're paying a lot of money to go to class and to be with the professor and to have conversation with your classmates. So much more powerful than if you're just watching each other on these little small screen in front of a computer.
Can you all hear me now?
Yes.
So let me help. Thank you. Good. This has been great. And I want to turn it now. You all are already turning it to really specifically what can communities do? What can a place like Chattanooga, or in Matt's question, what can his nonprofits do to promote this new narrative? And let me see if I can kick it off with a couple of threads here, if that's okay. One of the great promises that we hope to see was that access to technology was going to help open up the world for underserved communities. And we haven't seen the promise of that. And I think one of the things a community like Chattanooga could do is look at access to technology, access to computers, and access to the internet as a necessary public utility, more like a necessary public utility and less like a commodity. I think we saw the widening wealth gap happen in education and only accelerated during COVID when schools that went distance, the students that had good, easy access kept track, and those that didn't were left behind. So I think a very powerful way that a community can get behind supporting an education ecosystem is rethinking its whole fundamental assumptions about access to technology and the internet. Not that online learning is going to be everything, but there's tremendous opportunity there. And I think Steve and Lee's dialogue about scale versus sort of local indigenous narrative is fascinating. And I also think something that communities need to think about. I talk about the Budweiserization and the McDonald'sization of America that happened when we wanted to make everything uniform and predictable from every corner of the communities. And we're retrenching now from that. It turns out that that's not the best hamburger, is the replicable hamburger and scalable hamburger across the country. And so I think Lee's on to something here about rooting education back in the community in ways that these different learning communities, Steve, can learn from each other and replicate perhaps more than scale. And so I'd like to see communities like Chattanooga really support and promote the innovation continue that we've seen in education. And think that there are ways to do that, primarily by turning accountability, by being more discerning with accountability, using a scalpel rather than a chainsaw. Ross, you talked about getting to core sort of important skills versus seat time and content absorption. And, it's important that we make sure if a kid goes to school, they come out literate. Linguistically literate, numerically literate, and literate basically in civil citizenry. But beyond that, the standardized testing business has just gone out of control. And so that seems to me three things that communities could do to really help promote a healthier ecosystem. But in our last 10, 11 minutes here, I'd like you all to comment on that. What can a town like Chattanooga do to create a better, more healthy, more productive, create this new narrative you keep talking about?
I'd like to jump in here to talk about human beings. Who are school systems hiring? How are they retaining them? How are they creating a sustainable profession for educators within the Chattanooga space of schools? How I think that we can come up with, and schools actually have done a pretty good job of coming up with aspirational language and thinking about what they would like to do, but we haven't put the emphasis we need to take care of and steward and ensure the sustainability of the professional community of teachers who are actually working with kids. And my worry there is we've actually deprofessionalized teaching. And that is, that's more than a minor problem. Nothing is going to happen that's good unless you have people who are choosing to be in that space, who are not martyrs to that space. Our kids don't need martyrs who are thinking about how little they're being paid for how much they're sacrificing. They need people who are choosing every day to live their professional lives into that space and that they feel fairly compensated and supported in doing that work. And frankly, it's been too easy to let that fall a little bit behind and a little bit more behind until suddenly teaching isn't a profession. The actions of it are. There are incredible teachers doing great work in Chattanooga and everywhere right now, but you're not going to have the critical mass of people who can bear the weight of what's demanded of educators in the coming years unless you're changing that equation somehow. And I worry about how you're going to hire moving forward unless you have a compelling case to make.
Ross, let me jump in here. This Valentine's weekend, you just scored massive points with my mother. She spent 37 years. She spent, I think 37 years working in the Chattanooga public school system as her second career, by the way, as a middle school guidance counselor. So over the years, we spent a lot of time talking about all of the problems and challenges and hopes and dreams of education. But if you asked her, how do we fix it? She has had one answer for those 37 and then I think maybe 20 since she's retired, which is pay teachers like professionals. That if we could get the right people in the room, compensate them properly, and support their growth and collegiality, that's the number one most important way to address what's happening in schools. I don't know if she's right, but it's Valentine's Day weekend, and I'm going to give that out to her and her solution. Thank you, Ross.
It's always been my goal to keep your mother happy. So that's good. And
it's a good one.
I don't think
mine too.
Paying, tripling their pay. It's not that. It's like I think standardized testing, the way it's currently incarnated, can break down on its own weight. It's break down on its own. You see it happening to AP and SATs and whatever else. But we have to have people who are there not as martyrs but as committed professionals, whatever that takes.
Yeah, I'm curious back to this community, Chattanooga. Many of us were inspired by the poem of Amanda Gorman. Right? There's something about the artist shows up. The artist within the community shows up and give language and give visual, give a sense of life to this other life that we have a hard time expressing what it is. It would be interesting if there is a local movement of gathering the artists within the Chattanooga community, and maybe it's a series of listening tour in a way, and together, just bring some language to this new world that is Chattanooga that you want to design for, right? And then everything could emerge from that. But that's part of the problem, is that we have no language to explain what does it mean to live in a much more just and equitable world, where passions and intentions and purpose and joy of living is beyond, getting to college and then finding a job, right? I mean, that potentially is sort of old narrative. And it's really saddened to hear stories of parents attending kindergartens, parents' night, and wanting to make sure that their kids are on track to take calculus in high school. I mean, that's how far it's gone back, because parents are also dying for this new narrative of whatever life could be, that is much more happy and healthy for their kids. So I think that would be an interesting just to explore that aspects of it for Chattanooga.
Steve, any final thoughts? Oh, I've enjoyed listening to Ross and their wisdom. This kind of started with the question of what some of the impacts of trajectory afterwards. The thing that I've picked up on is that as frustrated as many school leaders and educators were with the necessity of going online immediately, I do believe it's created, even if they would tell you no now, it has created an acceptance that was accelerated very much so, acceptance of the ability of utilizing digital learning platforms and capabilities. And so I think that moderate pace that I talked about earlier has been accelerated this year. Then I go back to what Lee had talked about, the danger of everything just going back to normal, racing back to the way it was, and how do community leaders, school leaders, educators stop that and prevent that and take advantage of some of the gain we've received this year, we've gotten this year that was forced on us, and at the same time be mindful of the fact that we probably don't want to go back to the way it was before, at least in every situation.
Amen. Those are good words to end on. I want to thank you guys, thank the panel, Ross, Lee, and Steve, for taking time on Saturday afternoon to have this conversation. I want to thank our listeners, those who are live and those who watch the recording later. Apologize for some of the technical difficulties. I think some of those were here with me. Take the other one. But I want to encourage everybody to continue to follow these guys on the panel through their websites, and they have different presences in social media. You can get all that biographic information and their main web links here in their bios at Run the World, and pay attention to them. This is a rich conversation that I know they are not only having as a Saturday afternoon dialogue, but they are living it and breathing it around the country and around the globe through the organizations affiliated. I'm inspired by them and proud to know them. And I'm happy for Chattanooga to be able to have an opportunity to be part of this conversation. And just remember to thank a teacher and encourage your community to pay your teachers. I'll just leave it there and wish you all a very, very happy weekend and happy Valentine's Day. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.